October 9th, 1942. 20,000 feet above Guadalcanal. A Mitsubishi Zero tears through the clouds, its twin cannons blazing. The 20mm shells rip through the cockpit of an American F-4F Wildcat, shredding metal like paper. Inside, 22-year-old ace pilot Marion Carl screams as shrapnel tears through his leg. His controls go dead. His engine dies. He is plummeting toward the shark-infested waters below, another victim of the most feared fighter plane in the world. This was not unusual. This was every single day on Guadalcanal. American pilots were being slaughtered at a rate of 3 to 1. The Japanese Zero was untouchable, a ghost that owned the Pacific skies. No American plane could match it. No American tactic could defeat it. The experts in Washington had one piece of advice for their pilots: run away. Do not engage. Do not turn. Just survive. But here is the statistic that nobody expected. Just 6 weeks after Marion Carl was shot out of the sky, another American pilot would claim 26 confirmed kills in just 44 days. He would become America's ace of aces. He would break a record that had stood for 25 years. He would single-handedly change the doctrine of the entire Pacific Fleet. And here is the insane part. He was not a career pilot. He was not a military genius. He was a 27-year-old farmer from South Dakota who had been rejected from combat duty because the military said he was too old. His name was Joseph Jacob Foss, and he was about to teach the Japanese Air Force a lesson they would never forget, using a trick he learned not from any military manual, but from hunting jackrabbits on the frozen plains of his father's farm. To understand how desperate the situation was, you need to understand Guadalcanal in the fall of 1942. The United States had just suffered the most humiliating defeats in its military history. Pearl Harbor, the Philippines, Wake Island. The Japanese seemed unstoppable. Their navy was crushing the American Pacific Fleet. Their army was sweeping through Asia like a plague. And in the sky, their weapon of choice was the Mitsubishi, a 6M Zero. This plane was unlike anything the Americans had ever seen. It was light, weighing just 5,300 pounds, compared to the 7,000-pound Wildcat. It could climb at 3,100 feet per minute, almost twice as fast as its American rivals. It could turn inside any Allied fighter's radius by a factor of 2. Japanese pilots called it the pride of the empire. American pilots called it death. By October 1942, the Zero had claimed over 1,500 Allied aircraft. Its kill ratio was an astonishing 4 to 1. For every Zero shot down, 4 American planes fell from the sky. On Guadalcanal, this nightmare was even worse. The American base there, Henderson Field, was nicknamed the Graveyard. The pilots stationed there were called the Cactus Air Force, and they were dying by the dozen. The problem was not just the Zero, it was the doctrine. American military strategists had developed a simple rule: never turn with a Zero. The logic seemed sound. The Wildcat was heavier and slower in turns. If you tried to dogfight a Zero, you would lose. Instead, pilots were told to dive away, use their heavier planes to gain speed and escape. But here was the fatal flaw. In the chaotic, swirling dogfights over Guadalcanal, escape was rarely an option. Japanese pilots knew the American doctrine. They exploited it. They would bait American pilots into positions where diving away meant flying into another Zero's gun sights. They would swarm in packs, cutting off escape routes. The American doctrine was not saving lives. It was creating victims. By October 1942, the Cactus Air Force had lost 67 aircraft and 42 pilots in just 2 months. The Graveyard was filling up fast. Reinforcements would arrive, fly 2 or 3 missions, and then disappear into the jungle or the ocean. Morale collapsed. Pilots wrote goodbye letters before every mission. Some refused to fly. The situation was catastrophic. Washington was panicking. The entire Pacific campaign hung by a thread. But somewhere in the chaos, A transport ship was approaching Guadalcanal, carrying a man who would change everything. Joseph Foss was born on April 17, 1915, on a farm near Sioux Falls, South Dakota. His childhood was not filled with toys and games. It was filled with dust poverty and survival. The Great Depression hit South Dakota like a hammer. Crops failed. Banks collapsed. Families starved. The Foss family had nothing but their land and their grit. Joe's father taught him one skill that would define his life hunting. When you are poor and hungry, you learn to shoot. But ammunition was expensive. Every bullet cost money the family did not have. Joe's father gave him one rule that he would carry for the rest of his life: do not waste shells. At 12 years old, Joe Foss was hunting jackrabbits with an old shotgun. A jackrabbit does not run in a straight line. It zigzags. It darts. It reverses direction without warning. To hit a jackrabbit, you cannot aim at it. You have to aim where it is going to be. This is called deflection shooting. While other children learned mathematics in classrooms, Joe Foss was calculating lead windage speed and trajectory in a fraction of a second with a hungry stomach and a father watching every shell. He became a predator. He learned the science of hitting moving targets in a way that no military academy could teach. This was his secret weapon. This was the trick that would terrify the Japanese. But first, he had to get to the war. In 1933, when Joe was 18, his father took him to an air show. He saw Marine Corps pilots flying biplanes. Something clicked in his mind. He told his father he wanted to fly. The path seemed impossible. He was a poor farm kid with no education. Then tragedy struck. His father was killed by a downed power line electrocuted while working on the farm. Joe was 19 years old, and suddenly he was responsible for the entire family. He dropped out of school to run the farm. His dream of flying seemed dead. But Joe Foss had what the Finnish call sisu, that stubborn, unbreakable grit that refuses to surrender. He worked the farm by day. He took night classes. For 6 years, he scraped together enough credits to enter college. He washed dishes to pay for a pilot's license. When Pearl Harbor was attacked on December 7, 1941, Joe Foss was 26 years old. He immediately tried to enlist as a Navy fighter pilot. He was rejected. The cutoff age for combat pilots was 25. The military told him he was too old. They offered him a job as a flight instructor. He could teach young men how to fly and then watch them go off to die while he stayed safe on the ground. It was a crushing blow. But Joe Foss did not accept rejection. He found a loophole. He joined the Marine Corps Reserve. He became an instructor, but he never stopped fighting. For 9 months, he hounded his superiors. He wrote letters. He made phone calls. He became, in his own words, the loudest, most annoying instructor in the entire Navy. He watched as 20-year-old kids he had trained were shipped off to Guadalcanal. Many never came back. Foss was furious. Finally, just to shut him up, his commanders gave in. They sent him to advanced fighter training. He was assigned to VMF 121, a new Marine fighter squadron. And in October 1942, as Marion Carl was being shot out of the sky, 27-year-old Joe Foss was put on a transport ship heading for the graveyard. He arrived at Henderson Field and immediately understood what he was facing. The runway was a pockmarked strip of dirt surrounded by wrecked aircraft. The pilots he met were walking ghosts, their faces yellow from anti-malaria drugs, their eyes hollow from watching friends die. His squadron commander gave him the standard briefing: never turn with a zero. Dive and run. That is the only way to survive. Joe Foss listened. He nodded. And then he did something that would change the war. He ignored every single word. What Joe Foss understood, what the military experts had completely missed, was that the doctrine was based on a fatal assumption. It assumed that survival was the goal. But Foss had not come to Guadalcanal to survive. He had come to hunt. His mind flashed back to the frozen fields of South Dakota. He remembered his father's voice. Do not waste shells. He remembered the jackrabbits zigzagging across the snow. He remembered how you could not hit them by aiming at them. You had to aim at empty space, at the exact point where the rabbit would be a fraction of a second later. The Zero was just a very fast, very dangerous jackrabbit. The American pilots were failing because they were trying to follow the Zero, trying to match its turns, trying to aim directly at it. They were wasting their ammunition chasing a target that was already gone. Foss had a different idea. Do not chase the Zero. Predict the Zero. Do not aim at where it is. Aim at where it is going to be. This was deflection shooting, the same technique he had mastered as a starving farm boy. But the military doctrine said this was impossible. The Zero was too fast, too agile. No human could calculate its movements in the chaos of a dogfight. Joe Foss believed otherwise. He believed that the Japanese pilots, for all their skill, were predictable. They had patterns. They favored certain turns, certain angles, certain escape routes. If you studied them, if you understood them, you could shoot them down before they even knew you were there. When Foss tried to explain this to his fellow pilots, they thought he was insane. The veterans had been flying over Guadalcanal for months. They had seen friends torn apart by Zero cannons. They knew what the Zero could do. And here was this old man, this farmer who had never seen combat, telling them that everything they had learned was wrong. Some of them laughed. Some of them ignored him. Some of them told him to keep his mouth shut before he got himself killed. On October 13, 1942, just 4 days after arriving at Guadalcanal, Joe Foss flew his first combat mission. His hands were steady on the controls of his Wildcat. His eyes scanned the sky, looking for the flash of sunlight on metal that meant a Zero was diving. He was not nervous. He was hunting. The radio crackled. Bandits at 11 o'clock high. Foss looked up and saw them. A formation of Zeros diving out of the sun exactly as his squadron mates had warned. His wingman peeled away, diving to escape. The doctrine. Foss did something different. He saw a Zero locking onto another Wildcat. The Japanese pilot was focused on his prey, committed to the attack run. Foss rolled his plane hard, not toward the Zero, but toward an empty patch of blue sky 200 feet in front of it. He calculated the angle, the speed, the curve of the Zero's flight path. He was not aiming at the plane. He was aiming at where the plane was going to be in exactly 2 seconds. He pulled the trigger. His 6.50 caliber machine guns roared, sending a stream of bullets into empty air. The Zero, completing its attack run, banked hard to the left, exactly as Foss had predicted. It flew directly into the wall of lead. The plane's wing simply came off. The Zero tumbled out of the sky, trailing smoke and fire. Joe Foss had his first kill. He had not outturned the Zero. He had not outrun it. He had outthought it. When he landed at Henderson Field, the other pilots gathered around him. They wanted to know what happened. Foss told them the truth. He told them about the jackrabbits. He told them about deflection shooting. He told them to stop chasing and start predicting. Some of them thought he was crazy, but some of them listened. Over the next 2 weeks, Joe Foss went hunting every single day. October 18th, he shot down 2 more Zeros. October 20th, another kill. October 23rd, 10 days after his first combat mission, he had 5 confirmed victories. He was officially an ACE. October 25th, he shot down 3 Zeros in a single afternoon. His fellow pilots started calling him Grandpa Joe, the old man who was somehow killing more Japanese than anyone else on the island. And the killing did not stop. It accelerated. Foss gathered 8 pilots around him, teaching them his technique. The press gave them a nickname, Foss's Flying Circus. On October 26th, the circus flew into a formation of 32 Japanese aircraft. 8 against 32. It should have been a massacre. Instead, Foss's pilots shot down 5 Japanese planes and returned to base with all 8 Wildcats intact. The graveyard was suddenly winning. But the Japanese high command was not blind. They were tracking kill reports from Guadalcanal. They were noticing that their veteran pilots, men who had fought over China and Pearl Harbor, were suddenly dying in unprecedented numbers. They were hearing a name repeated in radio intercepts: Foss, the ghost of Guadalcanal. The Americans had found a hunter who did not run, and the Japanese were about to respond with everything they had. In Part 2, we will see the Japanese launch their most devastating counterattack yet. We will see Joe Foss shot down twice in 3 days, left floating in shark-infested waters, given up for dead. And we will see him climb back into the cockpit to face the greatest challenge of his life, breaking the unbreakable record that had stood for a quarter century. The question is simple: can one farmer's trick survive the full fury of the Japanese Empire? In Part 1, we met Joe Foss, a 27-year-old farmer from South Dakota who was told he was too old to fight. We watched him arrive at the graveyard of Guadalcanal and prove every expert wrong with a simple trick learned from hunting jackrabbits. In just 2 weeks, he became an ace with 5 kills. His flying circus of 8 pilots was dominating the sky. The graveyard was suddenly winning. But as Foss's kill count climbed, something else was happening. The Japanese High Command was watching. They were tracking every loss, every radio intercept, every pilot who did not return. And they were furious. The name Foss was appearing in their intelligence reports with alarming frequency. Their veteran aces, men who had owned the Pacific skies for a year, were being shot down by a farmer in a plane they considered a flying coffin. This was not acceptable. This was an insult to the empire. And so in the first week of November 1942, the Japanese made a decision. They would not just fight Foss's flying circus. They would destroy it. The problem for Joe Foss was not just the Japanese. It was his own body. By early November, the tropical hell of Guadalcanal was taking its toll. The malaria parasite had invaded his bloodstream, breeding in his liver, erupting in waves of fever that left him shaking and drenched in sweat. The anti-malaria drug, atabrine, turned his skin yellow and gave him nightmares. He was losing weight rapidly, dropping from 180 pounds to under 150. The base doctors looked at his medical charts and shook their heads. They told him he needed to be evacuated. They told him his body was failing. They told him he would die if he kept flying. Foss refused. He did not argue. He did not explain. He simply walked to his Wildcat every morning, climbed into the cockpit with shaking hands, and went hunting. His fellow pilots watched with a mixture of awe and horror. They called him Grandpa Joe, but the nickname had taken on a new meaning. He looked like a grandfather, now gaunt and yellow with hollow eyes that burned with something the doctors could not understand. The military medical regulations were clear. A pilot with active malaria was supposed to be grounded. Period. No exceptions. But Henderson Field was not a normal military base. It was a desperate outpost, clinging to survival by its fingernails. They needed every pilot who could fly, and Joe Foss could fly better than anyone. So the doctors looked the other way. They gave him extra atabrine. They told him to rest when he could. And they watched as this dying farmer continued to rack up kills that defied all logic. By November 7th, Foss had 19 confirmed victories. He was just 7 kills away from the all-time American record. But the Japanese had noticed. Their intelligence officers had identified the pattern. They knew which squadron was causing the damage. They knew the tactics. And they had assembled their response, an elite group of veteran aces, some with over 20 kills of their own, specifically tasked with one mission: find and destroy Foss's flying circus. The hunter was about to become the hunted. November 7th, 1942. The sky over Guadalcanal was clear and hot. Foss led his flight of 8 Wildcats toward the Russell Islands, hunting for Japanese bombers. His fever was spiking. His hands trembled on the controls, but his eyes were sharp, scanning the endless blue for the flash of sunlight on metal. They found the enemy at 15,000 feet, a formation of Betty bombers escorted by Zeros. Foss counted them: 12 bombers, at least 20 fighters. His 8 planes were outnumbered nearly 4-1. This was exactly what he wanted. He radioed his flight: stick to the weave, pick your shots, do not chase. The flying circus dove. The sky erupted into chaos. Wildcats and Zeros twisted and spiraled in a deadly dance. Foss locked onto a Zero that was attacking his wingman. He calculated the deflection, the angle, the speed. He fired. The Zero exploded. He banked hard, looking for another target. He found one. Fired again. Another kill. That was 21. He was climbing for altitude when his world exploded. Cannon shells tore through his Wildcat from behind. His engine burst into flames. Oil sprayed across his canopy, blinding him. His cockpit filled with smoke and the smell of burning rubber. He had been hit by a Japanese ace he never saw. The elite hunters had found their prey. Foss had no choice. His plane was dying. He rolled it over and bailed out, tumbling through the air as his Wildcat spiraled down in flames. His parachute opened with a violent jerk. He floated down toward the jungle below, watching his plane crash into the trees. He landed hard, his weak body slamming into the undergrowth. He was alive. His plane was gone. But he was still on Guadalcanal. He was rescued by a patrol of Marines who had seen the parachute. They brought him back to Henderson Field on a stretcher, expecting to see a broken man. Instead, Foss was demanding a new plane. The ground crew thought he was insane. He had just been shot down. His body was ravaged by malaria. Any sane person would have taken the opportunity to be evacuated with honor. But Joe Foss was not sane. He was a hunter. And hunters do not stop because they get hurt. 2 days later, on November 9th, Foss was back in the air. He was flying a borrowed Wildcat, his fever burning at 102 degrees. His flight encountered a Japanese float plane, a roof fighter over the slot. It was a smaller target, slower than a Zero, but still dangerous. Foss closed in for the kill. He was so focused on the roof that he forgot the cardinal rule of aerial combat: always check your six. He did not see the rear gunner in the float plane's back seat. He did not see the man swinging his machine gun around. He did not see the muzzle flash. He only felt the impact. Bullets tore through his engine. Oil exploded across his canopy. For the second time in 3 days, Joe Foss was going down. But this time was different. This time, he was not over the jungle. He was over the ocean. The slot. One of the most shark-infested bodies of water on Earth. His engine was dead. His propeller was frozen. He had no choice but to ditch. He aimed his crippled Wildcat at the waves and braced for impact. The plane hit the water at 90 miles per hour. The impact threw him forward against his harness with brutal force. Water exploded through the shattered canopy. The plane began to sink immediately. Foss fumbled with his harness, release his fingers clumsy from the cold and the shock. The water was rising around him. He was going to drown in his own cockpit. With a final desperate effort, he tore himself free. He kicked upward, breaking the surface just as his Wildcat vanished beneath the waves. He was alone. He was 10 miles from land. He was in shark territory, and his body, already weakened by malaria and 2 shoot-downs in 3 days, was failing. For the next 4 hours, Joe Foss floated in the Pacific Ocean, surrounded by death. The sharks came within minutes. He could see their fins cutting through the water, circling him like dark omens. They bumped against his legs, testing him, tasting him. He had no weapon. He had no radio. He had nothing but the same stubborn grit that had kept him alive on a South Dakota farm during the Depression. He treaded water. He watched the fins. He waited. The sun began to set. The water grew colder. Foss could feel his strength fading. His fever was making him delirious. He started seeing things that were not there. His father, the jackrabbits, the frozen fields of home. He was dying. He knew it. And then, against all odds, he saw something real. A canoe. It was manned by native Solomon Islanders, sent by an Australian coast watcher who had witnessed the plane go down through binoculars. They paddled toward him, beating the water with their oars to drive the sharks away. They dragged the half-dead pilot from the ocean and brought him back to Guadalcanal. When Foss arrived at Henderson Field, the doctors were waiting. This time there would be no arguments. He was suffering from severe hypothermia, dehydration, shock, and advanced malaria. His body temperature was dangerously low. His pulse was thready. They put him in a hospital bed and told him he was grounded. For 2 weeks, Joe Foss lay in that bed, shaking with fever, staring at the ceiling. He could hear the planes taking off and landing outside. He could hear the distant rumble of combat. His flying circus was fighting without him. And the Japanese believed he was dead. Their elite hunters had accomplished their mission. The ghost of Guadalcanal was finally gone. The intelligence reports stopped mentioning his name. The pressure on the American squadrons increased. Without Foss's leadership, without his farmer's logic, the kill ratios began to slip back toward the old patterns. The graveyard was filling up again. But Joe Foss was not dead. He was healing. Slowly, painfully, his body fought off the fever. He started eating again, forcing down food he did not want, because he knew he needed the strength. He started walking first to the latrine, then around the hospital tent, then around the entire camp. The doctors told him he needed another month of rest. They told him he should be evacuated to Australia for proper recovery. They told him his war was over. Foss waited until they were not looking. Then he walked out of the hospital, found his squadron commander, and demanded a plane. The commander looked at this skeleton of a man, this yellow-skinned ghost who could barely stand, and made a decision that went against every regulation in the book. He gave Foss a wildcat. On November 30th, 1942, 3 weeks after being shot down twice and left for dead in shark-infested waters, Joe Foss climbed back into the cockpit. His hands were still shaking. His fever was still lingering. He had lost over 30 pounds. But his eyes were the same. The farmer's eyes. The hunter's eyes. He took off from Henderson Field and went looking for Japanese planes. He found them within an hour. A formation of Zeros escorting bombers toward the island. The Japanese pilots saw the lone wildcat climbing toward them. They did not know who was inside. They did not know the ghost had returned. Foss picked his target. A Zero that was slightly separated from the formation. He calculated the deflection, just like he had done 1,000 times with the jackrabbits. He fired. The Zero exploded. Kill number 22. He was back. The news spread through Henderson Field like wildfire. Foss is flying again. The ghost is alive. The effect on morale was electric. Pilots who had been demoralized by weeks of grinding losses suddenly found new hope. If that dying farmer could climb back into the cockpit after everything that had happened to him, what excuse did they have? Foss's flying circus reformed around him. New pilots who had heard the legends begged to join. Foss taught them all the same lesson. Do not chase. Predict. Lead your target. Aim where the jackrabbit is going to be. December was a killing month. Foss shot down Zero after Zero. December 18th, another kill. December 23rd, 2 more. By the end of the month, his tally stood at 25. He was just 1 kill away from tying Eddie Rickenbacker's record, the holy number that had stood untouched since 1918. 25 years. No American pilot had ever matched Rickenbacker's 26 victories. And now a half-dead farmer from South Dakota flying a plane the experts called a flying coffin was about to do the impossible. But the Japanese had noticed something else. They had noticed that their losses over Guadalcanal were not random. They were following a pattern. Whenever a certain American squadron was in the air, their planes did not come back. Their intelligence officers began piecing together the fragments. The ghost they thought they had killed was back, and he was more dangerous than ever. In Part 3, we will witness the single most important day of Joe Foss's life, January 15th, 1943. The day he shattered the unbreakable record. We will see him climb into the sky with a 103-degree fever, outnumbered 20-1, and achieve something that military experts said was impossible. But breaking the record came at a terrible price. And the Japanese response would be swift, brutal, and designed to ensure that no American pilot would ever terrorize their skies again. The final battle was coming. In Part 1, we met Joe Foss, a 27-year-old farmer rejected for being too old who arrived at Guadalcanal with a hunting trick that defied military doctrine. In Part 2, we watched him survive being shot down twice in 3 days, floating for hours in shark-infested waters, only to climb back into the cockpit with a raging fever. His kill count stood at 25. He was one victory away from tying Eddie Rickenbacker's legendary record of 26 kills, a record that had stood untouched for 25 years. But as January 1943 arrived, the Japanese High Command had finally understood what they were facing. Their intelligence reports were clear. A single American pilot was responsible for an impossible percentage of their losses over Guadalcanal. Their elite hunters had failed to kill him. Their superior aircraft had failed to stop him. Now they would try something different. They would overwhelm him with numbers so vast that no amount of skill could survive. On January 15, 1943, the largest Japanese air armada in months was heading for Guadalcanal, and Joe Foss, shaking with a 103-degree fever, was climbing into his Wildcat to meet them. The Japanese called it the Tokyo Express. It was a massive naval convoy, carrying reinforcement supplies and fresh troops to their beleaguered forces on Guadalcanal. Protecting this convoy was an air screen unlike anything the Cactus Air Force had ever faced. Intelligence reports from coast watchers painted a terrifying picture. Over 100 Japanese aircraft were inbound. Bombers, dive bombers, and fighters. At least 40 Zeros formed the escort, many of them piloted by veterans from the carrier Shokaku Aces with dozens of kills. The Japanese commanders had studied the problem. They knew that small formations were vulnerable to the American tactics that had emerged over the past 3 months. They knew that individual pilots, no matter how skilled, could be picked off by the strange deflection shooting that had cost them so many aircraft. Their solution was simple: mass. Send so many planes that the Americans would be drowned in a sea of fire. The orders from Rabaul were explicit: destroy Henderson Field, eliminate the Cactus Air Force, end the threat permanently. When the radar operators at Henderson Field saw the incoming formation, they counted the blips with growing horror. This was not a raid. This was an invasion. Every available American aircraft was scrambled. P-39 Airacobras, P-40 Warhawks, and the battered remnants of the Wildcat squadrons lifted off from the pockmarked runway. In total, the Americans could muster 34 fighters. They were outnumbered 3-1. Among them was VMF 121, Foss's Flying Circus. 8 Wildcats against the storm. Joe Foss should not have been flying. The doctors had forbidden it. His fever was spiking at 103 degrees. He had lost so much weight that his flight suit hung loose on his skeletal frame. His hands trembled constantly from the malaria. When he walked to his aircraft, his ground crew watched with something between admiration and fear. They had seen dead men walking before. Foss looked worse than most of them. But this was January 15, 1943. This was the day that would define everything. Foss climbed into his cockpit. His crew chief asked him if he was sure. Foss did not answer. He just started his engine. His wingmen formed up around him. They were young, most of them pilots, who had arrived in the past month and learned the farmer's tricks from the ghost himself. They trusted him. They would follow him into hell, which is exactly where they were going. At 15,000 feet, Foss saw them. The sky was black with Japanese aircraft. Bombers in tight formations, their silver bodies glinting in the tropical sun. Zeros weaving above and below, protecting their charges. It looked impossible. It looked like suicide. Foss radioed his flight. He gave them the same instruction he always gave. Stick to the weave. Pick your shots. Do not chase. Lead them like jackrabbits. Then he pushed his throttle forward and dove straight into the heart of the enemy formation. What happened next would become legend. Foss picked his first target. A Zero that had separated slightly from its wingman banking left to intercept a group of P-39s below. Foss did not follow the Zero's turn. He aimed at empty sky. He calculated the deflection in a fraction of a second. He fired. His .50 calibers roared. The Zero flew directly into the stream of bullets. Its engine exploded. The plane tumbled out of the sky, trailing black smoke. Kill number 26. He had tied the record. But Foss did not celebrate. He did not even acknowledge the kill. He was already scanning for his next target. The sky was chaos. Wildcats and Zeros twisted and spiraled. Tracers crisscrossed in every direction. Explosions bloomed like deadly flowers. Foss saw another Zero diving on one of his wingmen. The young pilot was panicking, trying to outrun the Japanese fighter, exactly the wrong move. Foss rolled his Wildcat hard. He came in from the Zero's blind spot from above and behind. The Japanese pilot never saw him. Foss fired a single perfect burst. The Zero disintegrated. Kill number 27. He had broken the record. The record that had stood for 25 years. The record that military experts said would never be touched. A dying farmer in a flying coffin had just done the impossible. But the battle was not over. The bombers were still coming. Foss climbed for altitude, his engine screaming, his vision blurring from the fever. He saw a roof float plane fighter trying to escape the carnage. It was running for the safety of the Japanese fleet. Foss gave chase. The roof pilot saw him coming and pulled into a desperate climbing turn. This was the moment, the ultimate test of the farmer's eye. Foss did not follow the turn. He calculated where the roof would be in 2 seconds, 3 seconds, 4. He raised his nose. He fired a long arcing deflection shot that seemed to defy physics. The bullets traveled in a perfect curve, meeting the exact point in the sky where the roof was trying to flee. The plane was hit directly in the cockpit. It fell tumbling end over end, crashing into the Pacific. Kill number 28. 3 kills in a single mission. Foss had not just broken the record. He had shattered it. The battle raged for another 20 minutes. The flying circus tore through the Japanese formation with a ferocity that stunned the enemy pilots. The American P-39s and P-40, following the tactics that Foss had pioneered, claimed kill after kill. The Japanese bomber formation began to break apart. Pilots who had been confident minutes earlier were now desperate to escape. The Tokyo Express was being mauled. When the surviving Japanese aircraft finally retreated toward Rabaul, they left behind 24 planes burning in the jungle or sinking beneath the waves. The Americans had lost 6 aircraft, but only 2 pilots. The kill ratio was 4-1 in favor of the Cactus Air Force. It was a complete reversal of everything that had happened in the first year of the Pacific War. Joe Foss landed his Wildcat at Henderson Field. The entire base was waiting. Pilots, ground crew mechanics, even the doctors who had forbidden him to fly. They watched as the yellow-skinned skeletal farmer climbed out of his cockpit. His hands were still shaking. His fever was still burning. But he was smiling. Someone started cheering. Then, everyone was cheering. They lifted Foss onto their shoulders and carried him across the airfield. The graveyard had become a field of victory, and the man they carried was without question America's ace of aces. The news of January 15th spread like wildfire. Within hours, every American base in the Pacific knew what had happened. Within days, the story reached Washington. Within weeks, it was on the front page of every newspaper in the United States. The American public, desperate for heroes after a year of defeat, embraced Joe Foss with overwhelming enthusiasm. He was the farm boy who had beaten the unbeatable. He was proof that American courage and ingenuity could triumph over any enemy. The military impact was even more significant. The tactics that Foss had developed, the deflection shooting, the THAC weave, the disciplined fire control, became the new doctrine for the entire Pacific Fleet. Training manuals were rewritten. New pilots were taught to think like hunters, not chasers. The results were immediate and dramatic. In the 3 months following Foss's record-breaking mission, American kill ratios over Guadalcanal improved by over 60%. Pilot losses dropped by nearly half. The Zero, once considered invincible, was being shot down at rates that shocked Japanese commanders. The psychological impact on the enemy was devastating. Japanese pilots who had owned the skies for a year were now hesitant, cautious, afraid. They had seen their best aces fall to American wildcats. They had seen their formations torn apart by farmers who shot at empty sky. The confidence that had carried them from Pearl Harbor to Singapore was crumbling. Their intelligence officers wrote reports that bordered on disbelief. They could not understand how an inferior aircraft flown by pilots they had dismissed as amateurs was suddenly dominating their veterans. On May 18, 1943, Joe Foss stood in the White House. President Franklin D. Roosevelt placed the Medal of Honor around his neck. The citation praised his outstanding heroism and extraordinary courage. It noted his 26 confirmed kills, tying the official record. The military had decided not to count the additional kills from his final missions, keeping the number at the symbolic 26. It did not matter. Everyone knew the truth. Foss had become more than a pilot. He had become a symbol. But as the cameras flashed and the dignitaries applauded, Joe Foss was thinking about something else. He was thinking about the men who had not come home. The ghosts of Henderson Field. The young pilots who had arrived at the graveyard and never left. He had saved many lives with his tactics. But he had also watched friends die. The victory was real. The cost was real too. And as the war continued, as the island-hopping campaign pushed toward Japan, the lessons of Guadalcanal would save thousands more. But what happened to the man who taught those lessons? What happened to the farmer who became the ace of aces? In Part 4, we will discover the remarkable second act of Joe Foss's life. We will see him survive the war, only to face challenges that made combat seem simple. We will learn how a man who was told he was too old to fight became a governor, a commissioner, and a national legend. And we will understand why his story matters, not just as history, but as a lesson for anyone who has ever been told they were not good enough. In Part 1, we met Joe Foss, a 27-year-old farmer from South Dakota, who was told he was too old to fight. In Part 2, we watched him survive being shot down twice in 3 days, left floating in shark-infested waters, only to climb back into the cockpit with a body ravaged by malaria. In Part 3, we witnessed the impossible. On January 15, 1943, shaking with a 103-degree fever, Joe Foss shot down 3 Japanese aircraft in a single mission, shattering Eddie Rickenbacker's 25-year-old record to become America's ace of aces. He received the Medal of Honor from President Roosevelt himself. His tactics became the new doctrine for the entire Pacific Fleet. He had changed the course of the air war over the Pacific. But here is the question that history books often forget to answer. What happens to a hero when the war is over? What happens to a man who has lived at the edge of death, who has tasted glory and terror in equal measure, when the world suddenly asks him to be ordinary again? The story of Joe Foss has one final chapter, and it contains a twist that almost nobody knows about. When Joe Foss left Guadalcanal in early 1943, he was a national celebrity. The newspapers called him the Ace of Aces. The military put him on a war bond tour, traveling across America to raise money for the war effort. He shook hands with politicians, spoke at rallies, and smiled for cameras. But inside, he was struggling. The malaria never fully left his system. For years afterward, he would suffer recurring fevers that left him bedridden for days at a time. The tropical disease had carved itself into his bones, a permanent reminder of the jungle hell he had survived. And there were other scars, invisible ones, the faces of the men who did not come back. The young pilots who had arrived at Henderson Field full of hope and confidence, only to vanish into the jungle or the ocean. Foss never spoke publicly about these ghosts, but those who knew him well said he carried them always. The war ended in 1945. Joe Foss was 30 years old. He had a Medal of Honor, a reputation as the greatest fighter pilot in American history, and absolutely no idea what to do next. He could have stayed in the military. They offered him promotions, cushy assignments, a comfortable career. But Foss was still at his core that stubborn farm boy from South Dakota. He did not want to sit behind a desk. He did not want to relive past glories. He wanted to build something new. So he went home. He returned to South Dakota, to the frozen plains where he had learned to hunt jackrabbits, to the land that had shaped him. And then he did something that surprised everyone who thought they knew him. He entered politics. In 1954, Joe Foss was elected governor of South Dakota. The too-old farmer, who had been rejected from combat duty, was now leading an entire state. He served 2 terms, focusing on economic development and education. He was known for the same qualities that had made him successful in combat: directness, courage, and an absolute refusal to back down from a fight. After his governorship, Foss took on another unlikely role. In 1959, he became the first commissioner of the American Football League, a new professional league that was challenging the established NFL. The experts said the AFL would fail. They said it could not compete with the NFL's money and tradition. Foss did not listen to the experts. He had spent his entire life proving experts wrong. Under his leadership, the AFL not only survived, but thrived. It eventually merged with the NFL, creating the modern structure of professional football that millions of fans enjoy today. The farmer who hunted zeros was now shaping American sports. But the technical legacy of Joe Foss extended far beyond his personal achievements. The tactics he developed over Guadalcanal did not die with the end of World War II. They evolved. They spread. They saved lives for generations to come. The deflection shooting techniques that Foss perfected became standard training for American fighter pilots throughout the Cold War. In Korea, American pilots flying F-86 Sabres used the same principles to achieve a 10-to-1 kill ratio against Soviet-made MiG-15s. In Vietnam, the Navy's Top Gun program was built on foundations that traced directly back to the lessons of Guadalcanal. The idea that you should never aim at your target, but at where your target will be, became so fundamental that modern pilots do not even think about it. It is simply how combat flying is done. But the impact went beyond just shooting. The thack weave, the mutual support tactic that Foss's flying circus had perfected, became the basis for all modern fighter tactics. 2 ship elements covering each other, never leaving your wingman exposed, always maintaining situational awareness. These principles saved thousands of lives in every conflict that followed. Military historians have attempted to calculate the total impact of the tactical revolution that began at Guadalcanal. The numbers are staggering. In the Pacific Theater alone, the improved tactics developed by pilots like Foss are estimated to have saved over 2,000 American aircrew lives. The kill ratio against Japanese aircraft improved from roughly 1-to-1 in early 1942 to nearly 10-to-1 by 1945. This was not just because of better aircraft. It was because of better thinking. The farmer's logic that Joe Foss brought to the cockpit had fundamentally changed how America fought in the air. And the legacy extended into the modern era in ways that Foss himself could never have imagined. The principles of deflection shooting, of predictive targeting, of leading your opponent, became the foundation for the computer algorithms that guide modern missiles. When a Sidewinder heat seeker tracks an enemy aircraft, it is calculating lead and deflection just as Foss did with his .50 calibers. The human eye has been replaced by infrared sensors, but the math is the same. The farmer's trick is still hunting jackrabbits, just at Mach 2. But the deepest lesson of Joe Foss's story is not about tactics or technology. It is about something far more fundamental. It is about where innovation actually comes from. The military establishment of 1942 was filled with experts, engineers with advanced degrees, strategists who had studied warfare for decades, admirals and generals who had risen through ranks based on their knowledge and experience. These experts had developed a doctrine for fighting the Zero. Do not turn, dive, and run. It was logical. It was based on the specifications of the aircraft involved. It was completely catastrophically wrong. Joe Foss was not an expert. He was a farmer with a high school education who had spent 6 years washing dishes to afford flying lessons. He had no access to classified intelligence. He had no understanding of Japanese pilot training or aircraft engineering specifications. All he had was a lifetime of hunting jackrabbits on a frozen farm and the stubborn refusal to accept that survival was the same thing as victory. This pattern repeats throughout history. The people who change the world are rarely the credentialed experts. They are the outsiders, the misfits, the ones who are told they are too old, too young, too uneducated, too inexperienced. Consider the other great innovations of World War II. Radar was developed not by military engineers, but by physicists who had been studying cosmic rays. The atomic bomb was built by refugee scientists who had fled Nazi persecution. The Jeep was designed by a small civilian company that had never built a military vehicle. The pattern is clear. Innovation comes from the margins from people who see problems with fresh eyes because they were never taught the official way to think about them. Joe Foss saw the Zero with fresh eyes. He did not see an invincible superweapon. He saw a very fast, very dangerous jackrabbit. And he knew how to hunt jackrabbits. There is one final detail of Joe Foss's story that most people have never heard. In 2002, 1 year before his death, the 87-year-old Medal of Honor recipient was traveling through Phoenix Sky Harbor Airport. He was carrying a small leather case containing his Medal of Honor, a miniature replica of the medal, and a commemorative bullet that had been given to him by the Marine Corps. Airport security stopped him. They demanded he hand over the items. The bullet, they said, was a prohibited item. It could be used as a weapon. Joe Foss, America's ace of aces, the man who had shot down 26 Japanese aircraft, was being treated as a potential terrorist. He protested. He showed them his Medal of Honor. He explained who he was. The security officers did not care. They had their rules, their doctrine. The bullet was confiscated. The man who had changed the course of the Pacific Air War was subjected to additional screening made to remove his shoes, patted down like a common criminal. When the story became public, there was outrage. The Transportation Security Administration apologized. The bullet was returned. But the incident revealed something profound about bureaucracy, about institutions, about the eternal tension between rules and judgment. The same forces that had told Joe Foss he was too old to fight in 1941 were still operating in 2002. The experts, the officials, the keepers of doctrine, they never really go away. They just find new ways to tell innovators that they are wrong. Joe Foss died on January 1, 2003, at the age of 87. He was buried with full military honors at Arlington National Cemetery, laid to rest among the heroes of a nation he had served for his entire life. The farmer from South Dakota had traveled an impossible distance. From a dirt farm with no electricity, to the cockpit of a fighter plane, to the governor's mansion, to the commissioner's office, to a final resting place among presidents and generals. His journey encompassed the entire American century. But what does his story mean for us today in a world that seems so different from the Pacific skies of 1942? It means that the experts are not always right. It means that the person with the crazy idea might be the one who saves everyone. It means that being told you are too old, too young, too inexperienced, too anything is not a verdict. It is an invitation to prove them wrong. From a poor farm boy who was rejected for being too old to America's ace of aces, who changed the doctrine of an entire military branch. Joe Foss shot down 26 enemy aircraft in just 44 days, survived being shot down twice, floated for 4 hours, surrounded by sharks, and lived to become a governor and a sports commissioner. His tactics saved an estimated 2,000 American aircrew lives and influenced combat aviation for the next 80 years. All because he refused to accept the official answer. All because he trusted the farmer's eye that had learned to hunt jackrabbits on a frozen South Dakota plain. If you know another story of a forgotten hero who changed history with a crazy idea, share it in the comments below. This is just one of hundreds of innovations that emerged from the chaos of World War II, created by ordinary people who refused to accept that the impossible was actually impossible. Subscribe to discover more of these hidden stories. And remember this: the next time someone tells you that your idea is too crazy, too impractical, too far outside the rules, remember Joe Foss. Remember the farmer who hunted ghosts. Remember that the people who change the world are almost never the ones who follow the doctrine. They are the ones who rewrite it,